Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn in our study of Dante's Inferno now to Canto 4, what I'm just simply going to ask you to call Limbo and Circle 1. However, there's going to be an interesting Hall of Fame. We're reminded of that cataloging list thing that happens in all three of the major epics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. We're going to see several of those in the Divine Comedy, but we're going to see our first of those here in Limbo. And we got to talk about what this Limbo thing is. Dante had a challenge, as did St. Aquinas and any other number of Christian saints, philosophers. What do you do with all the people who lived and died, good people, supposedly good people, right, as we call them, before Christ dies, and therefore they have the opportunity of baptism? What are you going to do with that group of people? The answer is you put them in hell, but you put them in a place called Limbo that looks a little bit different from almost any other part of hell. Come to think of it, Limbo looks different from almost any other part of all of the Divine Comedy. Now again, if you haven't been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, find the AP folder. I am working off of the assumption that you have followed my comments, especially with full discussions of every book of the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, as well as everything from that point up through and including St. Augustine's Confessions as we turn to our study of Dante's Inferno. We've already given lectures over the first three cantos. We'll do this at the beginning of every lecture. Just to review, I like to put us in our place, if you will. I mean, we are, with Dante, studying a poet of place, right? On one count, you got to know the geography of the afterlife, and especially in our case, Inferno. In Book 1, or Canto 1, we have, of course, Dante on the 7th of April, 1300, that's Good Friday. All of that is significant, of course, in Christian theology. Lost in a dark wood, tries to climb the mountain. A leopard, a lion, and a wolf keep him from doing it. And Virgil shows up to say, "Let me help you." In Book 2, or Canto 2, we have the very brief invocation of the Muse. We have the information from Virgil that Beatrice, sent by Lucy, sent by Mary, has now come to Dante and say, "Let's go." And it's at the end of Canto 2 that Dante says, the pilgrim says, "I'm ready to go, let's go." In Canto 3, then, we will have the inscription above the gates of hell, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here," and all those other words we covered. Here we will find outside of hell, but in hell, if you get my drift, the uncommitted. And it seems as though that line, "I had not thought death had undone so many," it's almost as if the greatest number of people who ever live and die, Dante is saying, are the ones who can never make up their mind to do much of anything. And so in their afterlife, they're jacked, of course, by having those terrible stinging, wasps stinging them, the blood dripping down onto the ground where the maggots drink their blood, obviously allegorical as well as really gross. We get to the river of Acheron, where we will see Charon, the ferryman, and Dante will faint, and that's the conclusion of Canto 3. Let's now move to Canto 4 quickly. Before we do, though, just to remind, as we always do, we state our objectives and our focus at the very beginning of every one of these lectures. Just to remind, I know some of you are saying this gets so repetitive, and yet I really feel like it's an important thing that we actually follow what Aristotle argued. We're going to see Aristotle celebrated in Canto 4, so let's go ahead and just say it now. What Aristotle said about how you learn anything, St. Augustine, of course, knew this well, but even more, especially the great St. Thomas Aquinas, and he's the one that taught in many ways this to Dante, and that is this: the way you learn is kind of a three or a tripartite, we're back to threes again, right, step, where stage 1 is you got to have instruction, you got to be taught something. Stage 2 that's so important is you got to have examples, right? I mean, you got to see things. This is the point of art for Aquinas. This is the point of this poem for Dante. He learned this in many ways, of course, from his study of Virgil. But learning information, and even learning through examples like art, is not enough for Aquinas, and it's certainly Aristotle. There has to be that third, and that is, of course, the practice. So here we are, hopefully practicing our reading approach here. Again, the goal is that you read on your own, and I would say by this point in our studies together, since we began with our study of Hamilton's mythology and then the story-guided study of the Iliad, we should be challenging ourselves now to, for sure, read this material before you come to me. Of course, I'm reading it with you, each canto out loud with you, and we're exegeting, but I really recommend that you do your own work in advance. Of course, our learning theory, the connecting of new information to old information in meaningful ways, our greatest exemplar, since we have begun our study of the Iliad, our greatest exemplar of our learning theory is actually Dante. And of course, we'll look forward to Milton's Paradise Lost and then T.S. Eliot's Wasteland to follow. We, of course, will take care of our learning theory and our annotative approach by asking 3 guiding questions. Level 1, what does the text say? Level 2, what does the text mean? 2A, themes, messages. 2B, again, we're focusing on symbolism and irony because that's the game that we were playing with other epics like Iliad, Odyssey, and the Aeneid. Also, we're asking ourselves about Dante as poet, politician, and philosopher. And then finally at level 3 we ask, how can I relate to this information in meaningful ways? I got to find some way to do that at 3A by looking at other texts, especially the texts we studied obviously in AP. And then finally, how can I work with this information on my own? For example, I already mentioned it, let's put it in our notes one more time to get ready for 3A. We're going to see an interesting list of personages here. We're obviously going to want to celebrate those and the idea of the list from our study of the Iliad as well as the Odyssey and the Aeneid. Especially, you'll remember that catalog of ships and catalog of chariots in Iliad 2. We'll see the same game being played in some ways here. All right, let's do a real quick brief plot summary now of Canto 4. Dante's going to wake up to thunder. Okay, he's on the other side of the river. How he got there, we don't know, but there he is. He wakes up to thunder. Oh, what he thinks is thunder. What it actually is, although the poet doesn't really tell us this, we infer it by further reading of the poem, is that down below where Dante wakes up is hell itself outright, and the screaming and the groaning and the moaning of all the tortures sound like thunder from so many millions and billions of voices all in unison who are in pain, right? By the way, just to put a note here, in this brilliantly constructed canto, we go from darkness to light to darkness again, so pay attention to that as we go through this. Now we are in the first circle of hell. We call this Limbo, where the unbaptized pagans, the good pagans are, and this is actually where Virgil lives when he's not being guide to Dante, okay? Dante in this circle is going to meet a lot of famous pagans, as it's sometimes referred to, and interestingly, he himself will be included in the entourage of the great poets, great writers. There's a really interesting mnemonic for Canto 4 and the number 4, because 4 famous writers come up and greet Virgil, and then Dante is included to make 6, and they're all walking together. It's kind of a significant moment. Of course, think about what this does, right? I mean, talk about Dante the writer having a bit of an ego. So he puts Dante the pilgrim in limbo, talking with the greatest writers of all time, and they go, "Hey, you're one of us. Great job, great job, great job! What you are attempting and what you continue to attempt." All right, let's look at it now. Canto 4. We begin with breaking the deep sleep that filled my head. A heavy clap of thunder startled me up as though by force. Now, this notion of waking up, what you'll be reminded, of course, of our study of Thoreau's Walden. We must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn that does not forsake us in our soundest sleep. I know of no more encouraging fact than he calls it a fact because you can't get around it, he says. He says it's the most encouraging fact that one can elevate one's life with a conscious endeavor. Pure Dante, and here we are, waking up. We're going to have a lot of this waking up. It's one of the reasons I want you to put it in your notes now. We're going to see this a lot, where Dante will swoon and then he'll wake up. Or he'll have an epiphany, as Joyce will call it later in our study. A realization of something that's profound. So he wakes up. With a heavy clap of thunder, it startles him as though by force. With rested eyes, I stood, peering to find where I was. The question of location is significant. Write it in your notes. Both geographic location, literally, where are we? Oh, we're in circle 1 of Dante of Inferno called Limbo. Or where are we spiritually speaking or emotionally speaking? And so it's going to be an important part of our study, right? To find where I was. In truth, the lip above the chasm of pain, which holds the din, noise, of infinite grief. That's actually the thunder, in fact, that woke him up. A gulf so dark and deep, we begin with darkness, and murky, that though I gazed intently down into the canyon, I could see nothing below it. We are back, of course, to Book 7 of Plato's Republic and the cave allegory. In other words, he says, I looked down, I couldn't see anything. It was so dark. And then the quote marks. Now, this is Virgil speaking, now we descend into the sightless zone. And of course, no question, we will marry this now we descend into the opening lines of Plato's Republic, Book 1, I went down to the Piraeus. The idea of going down is usually some notion of evil. Going up is some notion of enlightenment. Now we descend into the sightless zone. We're not going to see very well, the poet began. Dead pale now. In other words, Virgil is pale. I will go ahead, you second. I'm going to lead you through this, in other words. But notice Dante the Pilgrim says, I answered seeing his pallor, the fact that he's pale. How can I venture here if even you, who have encouraged me every time I falter, turn white with fear? In other words, this will be the first example of many examples of Dante the Pilgrim misreading. I told you this is going to be a poem about reading. If you want to be a great student, you need to learn how to read. If you're going to be a great reader, you need to read great classic works of literature. Of course, Inferno is a classic work of literature. What are we being taught? Sometimes you screw it up when you read. You don't get the correct interpretation. In other words, wow, I don't know about this following you, Virgil. I mean, look at you. You're like pale from fear, and I'm supposed to follow you. I mean, what about me? Virgil will respond, it is the pain people here suffer that paints my face this color of pity, which you mistake for fear. In other words, no, this isn't fear. What we're about to join in Limbo are a lot of people who will never see God, and for that I pity them, in other words. Now, on. Our long road urges us forward. This is a key line. Let's make a note of it. Our long road urges us forward. We are going on a long journey. And this is, in fact, Dante the poet wants to tell you, the reader, this is going to be a long poem. But Dante the Pilgrim needs to hear from Virgil, we're about to go through a lot of stuff, dude. This is going to take us a while. Let's get ready to go to work, in other words, right? And he entered the abyss's first ingirding circle. So here we are, circle 1. And down he had me enter it too. Here we encountered no laments that we could hear. Let's make a note. In Limbo, unlike every other part of hell, and by the way, the only time in all of Inferno where Dante the Pilgrim will take in all of hell and all of the attack on his senses, especially his hearing, will happen right in the opening lines of Canto 4. And then now everything starts to become kind of focused or zeroed in on wherever we are. Do you get me? Do you understand what I'm saying? So for example, here, there's no sounds in Limbo. It's marked with silence and sighing. Put that in your notes, it's important. No laments that we could hear, except for sighs that trembled the timeless air. In other words, it's eternal. They emanated from the shadowy sadness, not agonies, of multitudes of children and women and men. He said, and don't you ask, what spirits are these? In other words, I can't believe you haven't already, come on, let's go. You should be asking me right away. And what do we got here? And what do we got here, right? Before you go on, I tell you, Virgil says, they did not sin. If they have merit, it can't suffice without baptism. Portal to the faith you maintain. Interesting theological quandary. What do you do with somebody who has lived a decent life? We will think, for example, of Plato or Aristotle or Virgil himself. What do you do with these guys? Because obviously they can't be baptized. That is to say, they can be good people, but they will never get to see God. And because they know that, they live in limbo. They're not in any kind of torture, agony, but they sigh out of sadness because they did not get to see God, because they did not have the exposure of the Christian faith. And so this is where they will be put. Some lived before the Christian faith so that they did not worship God aright. By the way, just to skip back, before you go on, I tell you, he says, they did not sin. If they have merit, it can't suffice without baptism. Now, the unbaptized infants, we're going to come back to this in our study of Purgatorio, if you go on to read that one in books 6 and 7, when Sordello will have a conversation with Dante the Pilgrim. This is one example of many I could give. I'm going to try to refrain from doing too much of this, but just an example of where what's a topic that's raised in Inferno will then be picked up with in our study of Purgatory and Paradiso to follow. Baptism, portal to the faith you maintain. Some lived before the Christian faith so that they did not worship God aright. And I am one of these. Though through this, no other fault, we are lost, afflicted only this one way, that having no hope, we're back to the abandoned hope right line, we live in longing. In other words, the idea is that the reason we're sad is we long to be able to know the Christian faith. Now, this is obviously Dante's celebration of his own Christian faith, right? Back to Dante now, the poet. I heard these words with heartfelt grief that seized on me, knowing how many worthy souls endured suspension in that limbo. In other words, now we have another moment of compassion. In other words, it's almost like Dante the Pilgrim goes, oh yeah, I guess I never thought about that. What about all the people that lived and died before the opportunity of Christian baptism, and therefore even the opportunity to go to purgatory or to heaven? Okay. And then, dear sir, my master, I began, wanting to be reassured in the faith that conquers every error. Notice the word faith here. Did ever anyone go forth from here by his own good, or perhaps another's, to join the blessed after? In other words, was there ever a time when some of the people from Limbo were allowed to leave Limbo, even though technically they were not Christians? Now, this is going to set us up for an important teaching of the church. Dante, of course, familiar with it by 1215, called the harrowing of hell in Christian theology, especially Catholic theology. And the idea is that once Christ was crucified on the cross and was dead, he went down into the underworld and he recovered a goodly number of the lost, and by lost here we just simply mean they died before Christ came and died, patriarchs. So what are you going to do with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the rest of them? This harrowing of hell theology said Christ came and got them and rescued them, and this is exactly what Dante is referring to. Did ever anyone go forth from here by his own good, or perhaps another's, to join the blessed after? Line 40 now. He understood my covert meaning and said, I was new to this condition. Dante, or Virgil had just died, of course, during close to the time of Christ's crucifixion. When I beheld a mighty one, notice Jesus' name is never mentioned in hell for the very fact that we are in hell, right? A mighty one who descended here, arrayed with a crown of victory. And he recalled, this is this harrowing of hell idea, he recalled back from this place the shade of our first parent and his son Abel. So now we have not just the mention of Adam earlier, but Abel, and other shades who dwelled in Limbo. Noah and Moses, the obedient giver of laws, by the way, notice the word obedient, right? Went with him, and Abraham, the patriarch, King David, and Israel, Jacob, right, went, and Israel's sire and children, and Rachel. We've heard Rachel now mentioned a couple of times. And Rachel, for whom he labored so long, and many others. And his coming here made them blessed and rescued them. Know this, no human soul was saved till these. In other words, these were the first actual saved, because Christ came and got them right at the moment that he was crucified. We did not stop our traveling while he spoke, but kept on passing through the woods. Not trees, but a wood of thronging spirits. Notice here we've gone to a different wood. This is not the wood of error, this is the wood of limbo, right? Nor did we make much distance from that place where I had slept, when I saw fire. Again, every time you notice fire, you want to write it down in Dante's Inferno. It's going to be significant. A fire that overcame a bleak hemisphere of darkness. So again, notice we go from darkness to light, and then at the end of the canto to darkness. Well, before we stopped to address them, I could see people there and sense they were honorable folk. In other words, they were good people, right? O master, apt in science and art, who honor both, what wins these shades distinction? In other words, how come these guys get to sit with light and the other ones are in darkness? Who are they who command a place so separate from the other ones? Now, some have argued, and I kind of like this argument, that this is in many ways the birth of the notion of classic texts, classic writers. In other words, the question is, how come in AP English we select certain kind of writers and we study them to the exclusion of other writers? This is a fair question, because you can't read everything in a class, right? A humanities course, or any other kind of course for that matter. So how come certain get selected and others don't? This is really the question. Now this will become a serious, debatable question by the 20th century, especially with the feminist critique and other kinds of critique and criticism. Marxist critique comes to mind. Why is it that so many voices are marginalized? Fundamentally, that's what Dante is asking. Why is it that these people are given a special kind of prominence in Limbo? And the answer, of course, is for Virgil, and of course for Dante the poet, that there are certain, what Yeats will later call in his Sailing to Byzantium, monuments of unaging intellect. In other words, these are the most important because they somehow survive. Of course, they survive because these are the stories that we continue to tell and retell. Unless, of course, as a culture, we decide to reject them, right? I mean, I'm lecturing, notice, these epics in a time when fewer and fewer people on the planet actually read the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, Beowulf, Dante's Inferno, Milton's Paradise Lost. I like to make the argument, though, that before you can make a decision about whether you're going to reject the Iliad, it probably makes sense to read the Iliad. Before you decide to reject any kind of text, it probably makes sense to expose yourself to that text, to have some sense of it. I'm not suggesting that the Inferno is a classic text because some authority figure is telling it to you. I want to suggest that at level 3, especially B, that you somehow can relate to the text in meaningful ways. By the way, you can relate to it and still reject some or all of it, by the way, okay? Here's Virgil's response to everything I just said. They're honored names. Think about the notion of honor as it relates to the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and that idea of kleos, as it's called, as we called it in our study, especially of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Kleos, that notion of glory. Their honored names, which still resound in your life above, have earned them heaven's grace, advancing them here. Meanwhile, a voice intoned. In other words, all of a sudden, now, somebody will speak to Virgil. Hail the great poet, whose shade had left this place and now returns. In other words, hey, there's a great poet that's coming. By the way, notice that it's very possible that Dante, the writer, is going to kind of have a bit of fun here. Are we talking about Virgil or are we talking about Dante, right? And notice, after the voice fell still, I saw 4, remember we're in Canto 4, so the mnemonic works easily here. I saw 4 great shades making their way to us. Their aspect neither sad nor joyful. Note well, my master began, the one who carries a sword and strides before the others as fits his role among these giants, he calls them giants, he is Homer, their lord, the sovereign poet. Now there's a bit of irony here, let's put it in our notes, because we know that Dante didn't read Greek. So whatever he knew of Homer, he knew in translation, and scholars usually argue, not very good translations. What he really knew about Homer was what he knew about Homer through Virgil, right? And yet notice here, Dante will have Virgil say, the greatest of us all, Homer. One more argument why, in the history of Western culture, we often will claim Homer as having precedence. It comes from a line like this.